Welcome to today's podcast of Reading Between the Lines. I am delighted to have as my guest today Pastor Chuck Ammons, who has just released his latest book, Reconstructing Dad. Let me get the subtitle here for you: Seeing God Through the Lens of Jesus.
Yeah.
This is an absolutely amazing book, folks. So I hope that you join us, listen in. If nothing else, go to the show notes, find the link, and buy the book.
Mm.
After you read it, you will want to buy more copies to pass on to family and friends. So, Chuck, welcome to today's show. Thank you so much for being here. You know what? Let me read your bio real quick and we'll get that out of the way.
Okay.
Um, Chuck is a father, a husband, a pastor, an author, and a friend whose greatest passion is to help people experience God's goodness as Father and to discover the greatness of their unique voice in his kingdom. That right there is enough to buy the book. He has been married to his high school sweetheart, Jill, since 2002, and they have 5 incredible kids. Chuck is a pastor at Overflow Church in the Tampa Bay area and is the author of 7 books. Now, does Reconstructing make your 7th or your 8th?
Number 8.
Eight,
Reconstructing is
okay.
number 8.
Need to update your bio.
That's right.
Chuck is also a member of the singer-songwriter group Valley's End, where he has enjoyed writing, singing, and performing alongside some of his closest friends. That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm going to have to look Valley's End up on YouTube. Do you have videos on YouTube?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh, great. Because I'm a huge music fan, but not of the typical.
Yeah,
You
me too.
know. I love the instrumental. My mom constantly had music playing. I grew up on, composers like Henry Mancini and singers like Frank Sinatra and Matt Monroe, Tony Bennett. So when rock came along, it just didn't quite sit with me. But I like to be able to understand the words, and that's where I really
100%.
struggle. It's one of the reasons why I don't listen to audiobooks, beside the fact that when I was a young mom and I was reading bedtime stories to my kids, I would fall asleep before the kids.
They were
Yeah.
very effective bedtime stories.
Yeah. So I have this, if I listen to an audio book and I I fall asleep.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. So anyway, I'm definitely going to have to go look up your Valley's End because that sounds pretty interesting. Um, your your book is one of those kinds of books where you can't just read it once.
Mhm.
And I'm working on my second time through right now, really trying to just dive in and learn and grow. One of the things, and you address this in the very first chapter, and that's the orphan spirit.
Yeah.
I and I've read Leif Hetland's book, Healing
Yeah.
the Orphan Spirit. I read it several years ago, and I'm thinking, you reminded me of that book, and I thought, man, I need to dig that book out again because my orphan spirit is still not healed. So part of what I'd kind of like for you to address a little bit here today is to talk about what that is and really the depth, there's
Yeah.
such depth. I mean, we can understand anything up here,
Yes.
but we've grown up with, with stuff. I mean, like for me, my father was both physically absent because he was a traveling salesman, was only home on the weekends, and he was very emotionally distant. So, and that was just his generation. I mean, he's from the builder generation, and
Right.
men just didn't show their emotions. So I've grown up with all this stuff and have gone through my whole adult lifehood with all these beliefs in my subconscious. And no matter how much I can understand it here, if I can't get it into my soul, I can't live it out. So if you could talk about that and how we can really truly heal that orphan spirit. I know you can only probably just touch on it. I mean,
Yeah,
you
well,
could talk about
and
it
Deb,
all day long, probably, right?
yeah, and I really think that at the foundational level, if you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, one of the things I share in the book is I believe that the human problem is the orphan spirit. So we all sin. There's a lot of different brands of sin. There's a lot of different types of struggles of sin, but I think they all go back to the orphan spirit. And it's very simply that God made us for intimacy with Him. He made us to know Him completely, to rely on Him completely, to be completely secure in Him. And that's why even when we get in the New Testament, Jesus is telling us, if you'd abide in me, that's where you bear fruit. So our whole totality of existence is to be found up in this intimate relationship. And from the garden, it was with God as our Father. We're son, we're daughter, we're chosen, we're His. And I believe the biggest thing that was lost at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was we were made for intimacy and we chose independence. And so the way I define the orphan spirit is this idea, and as far as I've been able to see in anything I've ever read, any biography, in all human experience, it is as close to universal as it can possibly be. That we, left to ourselves, have the belief, this is apart from the gospel, that it is up to us to protect ourselves, to provide for ourselves, or to promote our dream or agenda. And it's this, if it's to be, it's up to me. And Deb, when I realized that's where all of the anxiety, that's where all of the stress, that's where all of the fear, that's where all of the doubt, that what was really lost in the Garden of Eden was we lost our connection to Father. And then we saw that it's up to us. We're going to figure it out. And it's really funny, just a little theology nerd note for a minute, but when God even comes after the time of the fall back into the garden and immediately tells them that it's going to take the seed of a woman who is going to come at great cost to himself, that he's going to crush the enemy's head by crushing his heel. And he's, of course, speaking forward to Jesus' sacrifice.
Mhm.
What's fascinating, Deb, is immediately the orphan spirit's on display because right after that it says, and so Eve had a son, and she named him Cain, which means my weapon. And she says, I have made a son with the Lord's help. So here, she hears the promise to say, what's been lost, only I can restore. And immediately she jumps to, oh, seed of a woman? I'm the woman. This is my seed. He's my weapon. I made this with the Lord's help. And so you see, right from the start, that's where we've been. And I think it takes so many different manifestations based on whatever our personality is, based on our upbringing, based on our emotional level. But that one central line is that we've lost a connection to Father.
Mhm.
And this, I need to protect, provide, and promote myself is what has led to everything else that has followed.
Yeah. And it's healing that. I mean, um, I grew up, I mean, my dad was very stern, and I've been accused of being stern as well. And when someone told me that, I said, I'm not stern. But I understood stern is a different way. But yeah, when my reaction caused quite a bit of laughter in the room because it was in a class. And my pastor will not let me live it down. He constantly brings that up. But I grew up afraid of him because so much of the time when he was at home, he was disciplining. And we had a paddle that was called the paddle. It had a handle. It was like an inch thick piece of wood with a handle, and man, and it delivered a lot of pain. So I struggle to a degree. I mean, after I was an adult and after my dad was much older, he mellowed quite a bit as he got older. And we had common ground because he'd been
Yeah,
in the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps out of high school, and we both belonged to the Marine Corps League after we got out. And so we had that common ground. And I grew to understand that he did love me,
right.
but there's still all that junk that I grew up with. And it's very difficult for me to read verses like Psalm 37:4 that says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. I don't know how to do that.
Right.
because I see God too much of he's just waiting there to punish me. I mean, gosh, how many times I've heard that as an adult that, he's just up there waiting till I do something wrong and
Right.
they're going to zap me or punish me or whatever. So I can understand that it would be very difficult for so many people to embrace that dependence
Yes.
on God. And
Because
go ahead.
Yeah, because our concept of our father, right? We have a concept of father. And so our own experience or lack of experience with our dads is a direct correlation until, right? It's the act of inertia until a greater force comes and changes the trajectory. So for me, I don't have a moving picture memory of my dad. My dad died when I was 6 years old. And so I grew up practically without that voice in my life. I had my mom and sisters and praise God I have a stepdad that we have a great relationship now, but as I was coming up there was that void. And so what I found, Deb, is I did the same thing you do, is when I open up the pages of scripture to start reading about the Father, I project whatever my own image is. And then a lot of times what happens for us as adults, we're told, suck it up, get over it. I don't want to. So I was one of those that I didn't want to talk about my feelings. I didn't want to be a pity case. So it was like, look, I haven't seen the worst things of everything. I'm fine. And one of the revelations that got me was not only is the way we see our Father a direct correlation with God as Father, but for those of us as parents, the way we parent our children is a direct correlation with how we think God the Father parents us. And when I saw, so that's every act of frustration or patience. That's every time it's, well, I'm disappointed in you. So I found times when my kids were really little that I would come in this very pressuring, high intensity way. And when I stepped back from it, God said, yeah, that's how you think I am with you. You think I am high pressure. I'm waiting for you to fail. I'm ready to guilt you back into place when you don't get it right. And I think that's why at the core of all of this, when you have Jesus appearing on the scene, telling Philip, if you've seen me, you've seen who the Father has always been. And then the New Testament goes on to tell us in many places that Jesus came to be the unveiling of not only just the Bible, the Godhead creation, but he's the unveiling of who the Father has always been. And so it was your experience and my experience. We're just two strands that I'm sure many people listening can relate to say, oh, that's been me too, of this orphan spirit that comes. And it does take time and re-education and healing. And so for me, the journey of even bringing this book, it's been 8 years of writing, but a decade in the making of the refiner's fire. And that's for somebody who's been, I've been in ministry now 30 years and I've got the theological degrees and I've got the experience and I've got the time. But it was all of that stuff that I'd memorized. Like you said, Psalm 37:4. I had memorized that and I knew how a good Christian should feel. And man, it sounded great to say, wouldn't it be wonderful to delight myself in the Lord? But Deb, I was the one when I was 15, 16 years old, I would lock myself in my room to make myself read the Bible like a self-imposed prison sentence
Mm.
because I was afraid I was going to run out. And I had this feeling that if I didn't do it all just right, if I didn't confess my sins just right, if I didn't read enough of the Bible, that God was going to strike me. And so when it would thunderstorm outside, I live in Florida, so summers are constant thunderstorms. So every summer I would think it's Armageddon. Like God's coming, I messed up. And I think when we actually recognize, first of all, there's something healing, Deb, when we see it's not just me. Because I think we even carry a shame
Oh,
in that. What's wrong? Why can't I delight myself in the Lord? Why can't I abide? And because we have an accuser, the enemy wants to come and say, well, the problem is you don't hunger for God, you don't want God. And so my theology has become very simple. I believe all of humanity, all 8 billion of us, are hungering full tilt for God all the time because he alone is the bread of life that satisfies, and we've been made for intimacy with him. So the question is not if we're hungry, we're starving. The question is, what are we looking to feed us and will it satisfy? And so for me, all of that guilt, all of that shame, and all of those father wounds led me to start reading the Bible through a lens of fear and of shame. So I made the Bible a weapon, but I didn't point it at other people. I pointed it at myself. And it made this very exhausting Christianity that felt like either trying to climb ladders to climb out of my shame or trying to run on hamster wheels to try to finally become something. And when this revelation started to come that God is not split or separate, it's not God is angry at me and Jesus is forgiving. but who Jesus is the perfect reflection and the fullness, the New Testament says, of who the Father has always been. That he's not split, that Jesus actually came to remove the veil. That was when I realized it was time for me to reread the Old Testament under new eyes, not to try to deconstruct it, but to actually let the Lord reconstruct who he's always been.
Yeah. Well, and let me read this line from your introduction because it says so much with what you just talked about. We will only find wholeness when we let him draw near and reveal any beliefs we've taken on that are unworthy of the gospel. And
Yes.
then also, I don't know if you say this in the introduction, but I probably in the first chapter, your heart is crying out to be fathered. When I read that this morning, as I was preparing for this, and I thought, oh man, that really is me. But two things. Number one, how can I read the Bible through a new lens when I don't even know what lenses I'm looking at? Do you know what I mean? We all have
Yes.
these filters and experiences that we've just operated with our whole entire life. But if we don't recognize them, how can we set
Oh,
them
that's so
aside
good.
and read with a new lens? So,
Yeah. And one of the things I share even there in the first chapter, and there are many lenses, right, Deb? But I shared three of those lenses, what I call the three lenses of the orphan spirit. And I said where they tend to come is one would be this lens of scarcity. It's the view that there's not enough. So it's a fear-based view of the world. And so in the first chapter, I ask a bunch of questions about scarcity questions. Do you have a scarcity view of God that there's not going to be enough? I'm not going to be safe. It's not like I need to protect myself. So that scarcity is a fear-based view and a fear-based lens. And I give kind of a diagnostic of a bullet list of a lot of things that could sound like. The second would be a striving relationship with God, which was 100% mine. And that's a shame-based view. If scarcity says there's not enough, shame says I'm not enough. And so if I'm not enough, now I need to either outrun my shame or accomplish or become something that's lovable or worthy or approachable. And so then again, asked a lot of questions. And then finally, the last one is where it moves from fear to shame to pride. And that's a scapegoating lens. And if scarcity says there's not enough and shame says I'm not enough, then scapegoating says you're not enough. And what scapegoating does is it is always looking to somebody else that's the problem, somebody else to point out. And that can look just as quickly like a self-righteousness that's always angry, shouting, and pointing the finger at a group of people who sin differently than you. That's what I said our problem is as Christians is we're just mad at people who sin differently than us. We all sin, we all fall short, but I have grace if you sin like me because I understand that. But if you sin differently than me, then I'm really upset. And that could be scapegoating. But Deb, I've also learned as a pastor that scapegoating can just as quickly be this victim mentality that God's against me, the world's against me, I'm never going to win, it's never going to work out. And then inevitably, just with those three lenses, and we could go on and on and on, but the idea is the Bible calls the enemy, calls Satan the accuser of the brothers and sisters, the accuser of the brethren. And
mhm.
what he wants to do is come and to accuse God, accuse our own hearts, and accuse one another, right? He wants us just angry. And so this idea that God's not going to come through, and even those three that I traced, you can go look at Jesus's temptations, and all three of those are the temptations that he brought. There's not going to be enough. You're not going to be enough. And then ultimately, you're not going to be able to accomplish this dream or this thing that you want. Something's going to block you. And so, as a starting point, and I think what you've nailed, Deb, I love that you have given yourself rightly the permission and even the joy to say, I need to sit in this and I need to allow a time of re-education of this because for me, I had one way of reading the Bible for years and years and years and years and suddenly start seeing that God's heart was different than what I thought it was. And a lot of things that I read into the Bible, where I read in that God was angry, God was disappointed, God is mad, and they call it, psychologists call it the Bader-Meinhof syndrome. The idea of if there's a woman who suddenly gets pregnant, what does she see everywhere? Pregnant ladies.
Yeah.
You buy a red car, what do you suddenly see everywhere? Red cars.
Mhm.
And so what I've said is like, Deb, we Bader-Meinhof all over the Bible. Whatever our view is, that's what we see and look for confirming evidence everywhere. So when I walked with a shame-based view, I saw shame everywhere. I saw every verse to jump out and go, oh, that reinforces why I should be shameful. And that shouldn't surprise us because that's what the enemy has always done, is he takes and twists the word of God. If he can't get us to outright deny God, like that's what he would love, make us all atheists. But if he can't do that, then oh, the more sinister thing he can do is say, I'm going to get you to acknowledge God, but I'm going to make God into a monster in your mind that you can never please, that you can never live up to. Or I'm going to make what comes out of you in his name monstrous. A lot of things we've watched hurt and pain come in the name of religion. So I do think that the slowing down in patience is a huge thing. Is it would be the idea that if it's true, that as Zephaniah says, the Father is rejoicing over us with singing. And I'll tell you today, Deb, that's a wild picture for me. The idea that in an unseen realm, my name is being mentioned and God himself is rejoicing over me with dancing and singing. Those are two of the most vulnerable things you can do, right? If you ever see me dancing, I'm probably being held hostage, right? Something is probably wrong. So the idea that the Father is lavishly dancing at the thought of me is wild. And there are days that my emotions don't know what to do with it. And so that's where I come low and say, okay, if I'm going to believe the inspiration of Scripture and Jesus is the lens, then I'm going to recognize it might take my emotions some time to catch up with this and to heal and to realign. And that's okay. And I'll even let myself off the hook there and say, I'm just going to stay in the arena and trust that he's pleased and that he loves this re-education because this is the picture of the Father bringing us to complete maturity. And I love the way Paul says it. I think it's Second Corinthians. He talks about what happens when we come to Christ and the veil is removed. And then he says that we're experiencing him in ever increasing levels of glory. And I love that picture because what it means is that my view of Jesus 5 years ago was a lot less glorious than my view today. And that's by design. So I don't need to look back and judge that guy from 5 years ago. God was delighting in him and God's delighting now. But I also don't need to try to force myself to be where I might be in healing 6 months from now or a year from now. It's enough to actually just be in the present, which is what takes me back to that word abide. When God comes and says abide, I think it's him saying, like, Deb, even the work you're saying you're doing, asking the deep questions, looking at your own childhood, saying, here are the disconnects in that 18-inch journey from my head to my heart. And I don't know how to I know what the word says. I know what I should believe. But here I actually feel like a Christian unbeliever. I don't feel like I believe what I say I believe. And that's all of us. I think when we can slow down there and then say, Lord, would you begin to show me my lenses? And for me, Deb, the lenses are anything that doesn't look like the God whose arms are stretched out wide for friend and enemy alike. So when I see anything that tells me God is not like Jesus, then I go, oh, that's probably my filter, right? That's probably me. And then I'm going to come back in behind the veil and try to understand. And that's actually a huge reason I took the time that I took in writing this book was trying to give an introductory dive. And, I'm so grateful to be with a cloud of witnesses of other authors that have written books like this that have helped me to kind of see how do we retrace that thread and how do we even understand what our filters might be? Because we do tend to think God said it, that settles it, I believe it. And the truth is, God said it, we interpreted it through our lens, through our filter, through our bias. And then often we've made that to be the word of God. And sometimes that thing needs to be taken apart and healed and built back up under the cross.
Sometimes, any
Yeah, always, right? That's my
always,
gracious way of saying it. Every
always.
moment, every day.
It made me think of that line in the book. The word of God is inspired, but our interpretation of it isn't.
Yes.
I love that. I mean, gosh, so true. And I really enjoyed how you picked apart the Old Testament and how it was written, and the fact that they just sort of said, okay, well, God did it when it really wasn't God that did it. And I'm not saying this well enough. So can you address
Yeah.
that just a little bit so the listeners can understand?
Yeah, so one of the things that really got me is the way the Old Testament is written. We have to remember when we read ancient literature of any time, any place, if we don't understand their culture, their rules of writing, just like if you look back to even 1970 to today, how much has our lingo changed in the way we talk? Just in normal, right? Take an American teenager from 1970 to today, and we've already gone back and forth multiple times about words that would mean good in this era and bad in this era, and it's the same word, right?
Yeah.
So if we don't understand how a culture operates, then what happens is we superimpose our lens on it. And so one of the biggest ways we've done that is it was this phrase in the Old Testament, God said. because we'll have God said this or God did this, the Lord sent this. And so one of the things that was a beautiful blessing, having all of that theological education and tons of time studying Greek and Hebrew and teaching from the original languages, is when I started to see Jesus was the fullness and I went back in the Old Testament, it's readily apparent that there are things like what they call primary and secondary causes. So like for instance, in the Old Testament, there are times where a primary cause would be I made a decision, I did something, I am the one acting this out. A secondary cause is something else has happened, but I'm the one over the system and I've allowed it. And so I use an example within the book that there's a lot of times where it says, and God sent fire from heaven, or God sent this, or God said this. And when you read the story, even within the story, there's a lot of times where you can see that it wasn't God doing it, but God being sovereign and in his sovereignty allowing a free choice system where we make decisions. And so what you see in that is there's a lot of places where for the ancient Israelites, the number one thing they wanted their society to know is that there is one God, not many gods. Because in ancient culture, they had a god for the crops and a god for fertility and a god for, right? And all of their gods would war with one another. And so if you were not an Israelite, if you were an Ammonite or a Moabite and you worshiped all the other gods, your life was exhausting because what you were doing is trying to make sacrifices to this God without angering that God. And so you're constantly balancing how do I keep all of the gods happy? And so the Israelites come and they say, no, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. There's only one God. And so the primary thing they were trying to show in the nations is that nothing can happen apart from God's hand. They wanted everyone to understand that there's sovereignty so that if fire comes from the sky, if what we would call lightning, right? That's one of the differences is they say fire from the sky, we think, oh my gosh. And today we'd be like, there was a lightning storm outside, right? But if lightning comes from the sky, where we might say, no, God made the systems of the storms and these things that come, they would say, God sent fire from the sky. That was what God did because they want you to know it's not Zeus or it's not some other ancient idol or God that is lifting that up. And so I actually take some time to walk through that and give some specific concrete examples of where you see that. And what's beautiful, Deb, is all of this that we're sharing, it's not novel. This is not a new gospel that's suddenly being put out. These are things that I've got a wall full of books of commentaries from scholars across the board that readily say, yeah, this is the way ancient literature is written. So if you understand the rules and you understand what's happening, then you see why the Bible did some things. And one other one, and not immediately pertinent to this conversation, but it would give you an example. I've heard people say, well, why doesn't the Bible strictly condemn polygamy in the Old Testament? Why doesn't God just strictly say, no, it's wrong and it's bad? And I said, well, first of all, he actually did make clear what his heart was. From the beginning, it was not this way, Jesus later says. He says that God called for a man to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. The two would be one flesh, right? And so he said that was that. And Jesus tells us there was a problem that our heart was hard. But here's the other thing, Deb. The way Old Testament stories were written was written so that the point of the story was written within the story. When we see Abram being told to wait for God and to trust him because an heir is coming, and suddenly, like all of the other nations, he goes and marries his concubine, sleeps with her, Hagar gets pregnant, and we watch it turn into the Jerry Springer show, and everything goes wrong.
Yeah.
That's actually poetically intended to say, this is what that does. And so one of the things that happens is sometimes we demean the Bible of its actual poetic beauty in the story it's telling because we're wanting it to come and say, and God told Abram specifically right now, this is why I told you X, Y, Z. And it's written as a narrative that comes to the fullness of time with Jesus. And then Jesus removes the veil. And so sure enough, when we get to the Sermon on the Mount, we get a lot of clarity from Jesus to tell us what all these stories have been about the whole time and how much we weren't willing to see it.
Yeah. Wow. So much to take in and chew on. And like I said, I mean, it's going to take me a long time where I'll just read a chapter and chew on a chapter for a while. Um, and as I'm sitting here thinking, for me, I think at this point, there might be some other things, but I think the biggest thing right now holding me back is as far as the orphan spirit goes, man, I'm in all three of those.
Yeah.
The worst is probably, well, the worst is lack, but the self-worth is definitely a big part of it. And right now, I think it's almost like the last little thread. It's like I'm afraid to really embrace him because I don't want to be disappointed.
Yes.
Growing up all those years, constantly trying to please my dad and to earn his love. And that's what I've done with God.
Yes.
So at this point, it's like, God, I'm a little bit afraid to just let go of it all and sit back and abide, like you say, which is just rest in
Right.
God, because I don't want to be disappointed. Uh,
Yes.
so, yeah, there's probably a
And
lot of
that,
other people out there that feel the
well,
same
and
way.
that's been a lot of my story. And the advice I would give to anybody who's there is, the end of Psalm 23, it says, surely goodness and mercy follow me all the days of my life. And I remember when God gave, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I remember when God gave me a picture literally of a runner running, and God, who is goodness and mercy personified, is chasing him down on the path, right? Literally, goodness and mercy are following me. And here's the truth: God's a better runner than you are. He's going to catch you, right? And I think what the psalmist is saying in the end of all of that, because that psalm has everything. That psalm has the picture of the struggling to rest and the going through the field of my enemies and the shadow of death and all of that. But the end of it, through the trials, through the doubts, through the wrestling, is that God Himself wants this far more than we could ever want it. And so, if there's any hope I could give anybody who's in that, Deb, you're exactly where you need to be. Because I think the one thing God needs from us is the honesty and humility to be real and vulnerable and open before Him and say, "This is where I am." Because the whole point is we can't save ourselves. So for years, I tried to make myself surrender or make myself abide. And then it was the same question that I had of, I'm not ready to let go because I don't want to be disappointed because you're my whole world. This means far too much to me. And part of what I found is it's in the honesty that grace itself chases us down and God does it. So it's the point of you're exactly on the path you need to be, is to say, I'm going to keep being humble. I'm going to keep being honest. I'm going to keep seeking, I keep abiding, and all of the promises that He's given. We're going to reap a harvest because we don't give up. But I think that harvest we're going to reap is we're actually watching His goodness and mercy catch us and overtake us. And some of that, I don't know if this helps, but this was an analogy God gave me a long time ago. And I probably come to this weekly in my life, is that there are times in our life where we feel like we've gotten lost in the middle of the woods, right? We feel like just broken, we're stuck, destitute, scared. We don't know what to do. We're lost in the middle of the woods. And there are precisely two ways Jesus can rescue us. One of them is we're lost in the middle of the woods and we say, Jesus, help me. And suddenly we open our eyes and somehow miraculously we're on the outside of those woods and we don't know what happened, but we're there with Jesus and things are better. And that's when we receive this healing, miraculous touch from God. And I've had instances of that in my life that are undeniable and testimonies in my friend's life that I go, wow, that's amazing. But the second one, I think the second one is the far more regular way of God. And it's the one I've come to cherish much more, is that we're lost in the middle of the woods and we cry out, Jesus, would you help me? And we open our eyes to see that there's a hand in our hand. And God takes us a step at a time back out of those woods with us every step so that we can actually be a part of our healing and experience in partnership with God. And those are the ones that take, again, as I've told you, this book, Deb, is a decade, right? 8 books. The other ones might have been a few months here and there. This is a decade. And what I believe that was God taking me by the hand and saying, it's going to be so much more worth it for us to take this journey together. And for me, when I realized God was with me and that in itself was intimacy, then I was able to abide, not in the finished product, but to abide with Him in the midst of the process, in the midst of the mess, and going, oh, I'm abiding in the midst of my doubts and my fears. I'm abiding in the midst of like, my abiding right now looks like, I don't trust you, God. And He's like, great, but we're walking this path together. And it's a conversation, holding hands as I'm leading you out of the woods. And that for me has been so healing because it's been me taking the pressure off my own shoulders to try to save myself.
Mm, yeah. Wow. That is so good, Chuck. Thank you. Um, I've got a couple more questions, and so definitely we're going to have a part two to this, folks. So uh, be sure to come back for part two.